In January 2013, a young man walked into his high school gym and never came back out alive. Kendrick Johnson was found upside down inside a rolled up wrestling mat. His face was swollen, his body bruised, and his organs were later found missing. Authorities ruled it a tragic accident, but his family believes that it was a murder and cover up that reached the highest levels. There were conflicting autopsies, conclusions, lawsuits, and federal investigations. Even now, the truth about Kendrick's death remains clouded in mystery and controversy. Today, we're going to be breaking down the evidence, the autopsy reports, and the legal battle that turned a small town in Georgia into the center of a national firestorm. This is the chilling, complicated story of Kendrick Johnson and why his death still demands answers more than a decade later. Welcome to the True Crime Nurse, everyone. My name is Kat, and I'm a registered nurse who loves all things nursing and true crime. Please like, subscribe, and comment down below any case suggestions that you have, and I will be sure to take a look into them. All right, everyone, let's get into today's story. Kendrick Johnson was more than a case. He was a beloved son, brother, and friend. Born on October 10, 1995, Kendrick was 17 years old and a sophomore at Lowndes High School in Georgia. Friends and family described Kendrick as a sweet and quiet boy, and he was also known for his easygoing nature. Despite his quiet demeanor, though, Kendrick was an active teenager with big dreams and his entire future ahead of him. He was a three-sport athlete, playing football, basketball, and track. Those close to him said that he dreamed of playing professional football someday, and he showed real promise on the field. Kendrick's father, Kenneth Johnson, was deeply proud of his son's talent and character. They were very close, and Kenneth said that the last conversation he shared with Kendrick was about planning a father-son trip to Las Vegas. Kendrick was also popular among his classmates. He had a wide circle of friends between all different sports teams and classes. His easy smile and athletic skills made it really easy for him to be well known on campus. Kendrick's parents, Kenneth and Jacqueline or Jackie Johnson, raised him in Valdosta, which is a community in southern Georgia. They instilled in all their children the values of hard work and standing up for themselves. In fact, an important part of this case includes a prior bullying incident. The Johnsons later reported that Kendrick had been harassed and actually got into a fight with another student just about a year before his death. Kendrick's mother had complained to the school about this attack involving another classmate, and the family felt that the issue was never properly resolved. This context would later fuel the family's suspicion that Kendrick's death was not an accident. Kendrick's last day alive began like any other day, but ended in utter tragedy. On Thursday, January 10, 2013, Kendrick went to school at Lowndes High School after the holiday break. According to school records and witness accounts, he went through that day like any other. The first sign that something was wrong, though, was that he failed to show up to his fourth period class that afternoon. This was unusual for Kendrick. When he didn't return home from school, his family grew worried. That night, Kendrick's mother, Jackie, reported him missing to the authorities. The very next morning, January 11th, students at Lowndes High School made a shocking discovery. A group of kids in that old gymnasium that was mainly used at the time for wrestling and ROTC drills noticed a pair of feet sticking out from one of the large wrestling mats that was stored upright in the corner. The mats, which were made of thick foam and vinyl, were rolled up, standing vertically in a tight cluster, and each mat was about 6 feet tall when stood up. Looking closer, the students realized that a body was lodged head down inside the center of one of the rolled mats. They immediately notified the school, and staff called 911. Lowndes County Sheriff's Office deputies and emergency medical responders arrived quickly and confirmed the worst. The body was the missing student, Kendrick Johnson. He was found, like I mentioned already, upside down in the mat with his feet protruding from the top. Investigators at the scene noted that one of Kendrick's arms was stretched above his head and the other was down at his waist, which is consistent with someone struggling to free themselves inside of a tight space, and this detail truly broke my heart when I read about it. Kendrick did not have shoes on his feet. A single white and black gym shoe belonging to him was found inside the mat with him, near his head, and the other shoe was on the floor beneath the vertical mat stack. The shoe on the floor was lying on top of a pool of blood that had seeped out. Oddly, the shoe itself had no blood on it, though, which seemed mysterious to investigators. Also found nearby were a hooded sweatshirt, a pair of orange and black athletic shoes on the gym floor, as well as some traces of blood on the wall of the gym. Testing later showed that the blood on that wall actually did not belong to Kendrick and had likely been there for a very long time. It was old and dry blood. Investigators did not collect the hoodie or the other shoes at that time, though, that were at the crime scene. Kendrick's body had been in that inverted position for many hours, possibly overnight, leading to visible effects. Blood had pooled in his head and upper body due to gravity, causing extreme swelling in his face. When the body was finally removed from the mat, with the mat laid on its side and unrolled, witnesses described Kendrick's face as severely bloated and disfigured from the blood pressure and lividity. One photo later released by the family showed his face almost unrecognizable, bloated and darkened. Blood and fluids had exuded from Kendrick's nose and mouth, consistent with positional asphyxia, where pressure builds up in the head when a person is upside down for a prolonged period of time. This image, circulated later in the media, horrified the public and generated support for the Johnson family's quest for further answers. Sheriff's investigators initially treated the scene as a possible homicide, which is standard procedure until the cause of death can be determined. The school was placed on a brief lockdown that Friday morning just to secure the scene. Students stated that there was an announcement made during second period informing them that an incident had happened on campus, and later that day, they learned that a classmate had died. By midday, however, authorities were already indicating that they saw no immediate signs of foul play. The body was found with no obvious wounds or injuries externally, and the area did not show a sign of struggle like disturbed mats or defensive wounds on Kendrick initially. Lowndes County Sheriff Chris Pine and School Superintendent Wes Taylor released a joint statement by the end of that day, quote, "Although the exact cause of death is yet to be determined, as of this stage in the investigation, nothing has been discovered to indicate foul play was involved," end quote. They assured the community that the school appeared safe and classes resumed that same day after the initial alarm. Knowing that they just carried on normally that day bothers me, though. Let me know in the comments if you kind of feel this way too. I am an empath, so I know that I can see things differently sometimes, but you would think that they would want to secure that area as long as possible so that they could properly investigate and allow students to navigate their feelings too. But I'm a nurse, what do I know? Superintendent Taylor expressed the school's district's sorrow and support for the family in saying, quote, "We are deeply saddened that the body of a Lowndes High School student was discovered today on the LHS campus. Our hearts are burdened for the family, friends, student staff, and our community," end quote. Counselors were brought in to help students deal with the shock of losing a classmate on campus too. For Kendrick's parents, the news was devastating and confusing. Kenneth and Jackie Johnson arrived at the school as soon as they were notified. They saw the investigative activity and learned that their son's body had been found in such a strange and bizarre manner. Kenneth Johnson, in particular, could not accept that this was just an accident. He skeptically asked, quote, "How can you fall over into a rolled up mat," end quote. I've got to admit, this is my first question too. How? In those first painful moments, Kendrick's father had already been suspicious that someone or something was responsible for his son's death beyond it just being an accident still. Kenneth said, quote, "Whoever did this to my son will be punished," standing firm in his belief that Kendrick had been killed intentionally. Jackie Johnson, overcome with grief, could only sob as investigators worked the crime scene. The family's nightmare had begun, not only of losing their son, but because now they needed to figure out how and why their child died. After the crime scene was processed, Kendrick's body was transported to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, or GBI, medical examiner's office for autopsy. It was scheduled for Monday, January 14th, 2013. Meanwhile, the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office continued interviewing students and gathering further information. They stated that several students reported a common practice of actually tucking their shoes or other items inside the center of those rolled up mats. In fact, one student later told investigators that he and Kendrick actually shared a pair of Adidas sneakers for gym class, and Kendrick would often, quote, "go to the mats, jump up, and toss the shoes inside the middle of the hole," end quote, rather than paying for a locker. Does anyone else find this odd, though, having to pay for a locker? It's been a while since I've had to use one, but I only remember having to pay for a lock for your locker. But let me know if you've heard of this before. Investigators theorized that on January 10th, after his third period class ended, Kendrick went back into the old gym to retrieve his stored shoes. They believe that he may have seen one shoe fall down inside that mat, and rather than unstack the heavy mats, he climbed on top of the upright mat and tried to reach down into the center of the mat to grab his shoe. The mats were about 6 feet tall, like we talked about when rolled up, and the inner hole of each mat was about 14 inches in diameter. Now, Kendrick was 5'10", with shoulders about 19 inches across, meaning he likely had to put his arms or arm over his head and compress his shoulders to fit into that tight space. The police felt that it may have been possible for him to wiggle down into the mat far enough that he had become stuck upside down, with the mat's tightness pinning him. If no one was around to hear him or see him, he could not have freed himself. Tragically, investigators hypothesized that this is exactly what happened. Kendrick was trapped and inverted, slowly asphyxiated over a period of time, unable to breathe properly, and with blood pooling to his head. This hypothesis explained the lack of struggle signs and the absence of major injuries. If Kendrick essentially wedged himself in there, he might only have some minor scrapes or bruises from the mat's friction. The preliminary autopsy findings announced on January 14th indicated, quote, no injuries that could have caused the death, end quote. Sheriff Prine stated that nothing in the evidence collected so far pointed to homicide, calling it a terrible tragedy but likely an accident. He assured the public that the investigation would continue on until a definitive cause was determined, asking anyone with information to please come forward. The case in those initial days seemed on track to be closed as an accident, pending that formal autopsy report. However, even at this early stage, key questions and procedural issues were brewing that would later cast doubt on the whole investigation. One major issue was discovered by the county coroner, Bill Watson. Georgia law requires that the coroner be notified immediately in the event of a violent or unexplained death. Yet Coroner Watson was not called to the school until approximately 6 hours after Kendrick's body had been found. By the time he arrived, the scene had been thoroughly handled by law enforcement. This is common in healthcare as well. For those of you that don't know, if we have a person pass away under suspicious circumstances in the hospital, we have to contact the ME immediately and not touch the patient whatsoever. We even have to gently ask family to not touch their own loved ones because the timing and preservation of victims and patients is critical for the ME. In a report that he wrote on January 22, 2013, Coroner Watson blasted the handling of the scene. He said, quote, the investigative climate was very poor to worse when I arrived on scene. The body had been noticeably moved, the scene had been compromised, and there was no cooperation from law enforcement at the scene, end quote. He further complained that the integrity of the evidence was breached when, on January 13th, investigators unsealed the body bag to show Kendrick's body to his father, which is highly unusual before an autopsy is completed. He said, quote, I do not approve of the manner in which this case was handled, end quote, explicitly stating that the body was moved and information had been withheld from him. These are strong words from an official in charge of certifying the death. There also appeared to be two versions of the coroner's report. One detailed and critical, which Watson had actually signed himself, and a second unsigned report with toned-down language simply stating that he wasn't called until later. It's unclear why two reports existed or who even wrote the second one, but the inconsistencies were really concerning. At this time, though, those issues had not come to light fully yet. To the public, the story by mid-January 2013 was that Kendrick Johnson had tragically died by accident. The full autopsy results from the GBI were pending, but law enforcement gave every indication that they expected a finding of accidental death by positional asphyxia. In the coming weeks, that is exactly what the official report would state. This, of course, did not sit well with the Johnson family. Before we dive really deep into the medical findings, though, let's recap what the accident theory entails in medical terms. Positional asphyxia, the suspected cause, occurs when someone's position prevents them from breathing effectively. In Kendrick's case, being upside down in a narrow mat would have meant that his body weight and the mat's pressure compressed his chest, making it increasingly difficult to inhale. His lungs would struggle to expand, and over time, carbon dioxide would build up in his bloodstream as he slowly suffocated. Additionally, with his head lower than his heart, being upside down, gravity caused blood to pool in the vessels of his head and neck. This can lead to ruptured capillaries and bleeding from the nose and mouth. Unconsciousness can occur within just a few minutes due to lack of oxygen, and death follows if that position is not rapidly changed. Positional asphyxia is a known hazard in certain confined space accidents and is also a concern in some cases of restraint. If Kendrick was upside down for an extended period of time, possibly overnight, it is sadly possible that he slowly asphyxiated. The telltale sign would be congestion and swelling in the head, possibly petechial hemorrhages or tiny red or purple dots from burst blood vessels in the face or eyes, and fluid in the lungs or airways that are consistent with asphyxia. However, the Johnson family felt that something wasn't adding up. They questioned how Kendrick could have even gotten himself so deeply stuck without anyone hearing a commotion. Lowndes High School is a large school of over 3,000 students, and even though the old gym was in a less trafficked area, the idea that no one heard Kendrick's cries is really hard for anyone to believe. They also pointed to the size mismatch of Kendrick versus the mat's opening, arguing that he could not have fit accidentally. From the beginning, the family suspected that someone might have harmed Kendrick and possibly placed him in the mat after the fact. These suspicions grew as more information and misinformation emerged in the community and online. The first autopsy on Kendrick Johnson's body was conducted by Dr. Mary Ann Gaffney Kraft, a medical examiner with the Georgia Bureau of Investigations, or GBI, on January 14, 2013. This autopsy is critical because it formed the basis of official ruling on Kendrick's cause of death. The exam was completed that same day and initially found no indications of injury sufficient to cause death. Over the next few weeks, the GBI pathologist awaited results from toxicology tests and further analysis before issuing the final autopsy report. On May 2nd, nearly 4 months after Kendrick's death, the GBI autopsy report was released, formally concluding that Kendrick had died due to positional asphyxia and that the manner of death was accidental, not homicide. According to the report, Kendrick's death was consistent with him becoming entrapped upside down in the rolled-up mat and having suffocated. The medical examiner found no evidence of blunt trauma or lethal injury. There were no skull fractures, no significant hemorrhages to the brain, and no stab or gunshot wounds. Kendrick's organs, though, somewhat decomposed, especially in the upper organs due to that inverted position for a prolonged period of time, did not show acute injuries. There were some minor abrasions on parts of his body, possibly from the friction against the mat, or maybe even from efforts to try to remove him, but nothing indicated foul play. His face and head were severely swollen post-mortem, but that was attributed to the pooling of blood. The GBI autopsy did not note any obvious internal injuries like a broken neck or hemorrhaging around the carotid artery that would suggest foul play. In Kendrick's case, the absence of trauma or natural disease, combined with the scenario of being upside down in a confined space, led to that conclusion of asphyxiation. There are no definitive lab tests to prove positional asphyxia. It's diagnosed or reached by ruling out other causes. With the cause determined as suffocation and no evidence of foul play, the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office officially closed its case on Kendrick Johnson's death in the spring of 2013, calling it a tragic accident. Don't go yet, though. We have a lot more to talk about. As straightforward as the case seemed to authorities at that point, the Johnson family's doubts only intensified after the first autopsy. From their perspective, the investigation had been rushed and possibly compromised based on what Coroner Bill Watson's complaints were. They could not shake the feeling that something was off with the accident narrative. The odd detail of Kendrick's shoe lying on top of blood but had no blood on it, for example, really bothered them. And if Kendrick suffocated, why was there blood at all? The family was also troubled by how quickly the sheriff's department had reached their conclusion. Within 24 hours of finding Kendrick's body, even before the autopsy, officials were publicly leaning towards accident. This struck the Johnsons as prematurely dismissive of any other possibilities. By late April 2013, Jackie and Kenneth Johnson made a crucial decision. They would have Kendrick's body exhumed and independently examined. They wanted a second autopsy by a pathologist of their choosing to either confirm or contradict the GBI's findings. That was a really tough and painful choice for them because it meant that they would be disturbing Kendrick's rest, but they felt that it was the only way to uncover the truth. A Superior Court judge granted the family's request to exhume Kendrick's body, and on May 8, 2013, a little under 4 months after his brutal death, Kendrick's remains were unearthed for re-examination. On June 15, 2013, pathologist Dr. William R. Anderson of Forensic Dimensions in Florida conducted the second autopsy on Kendrick Johnson. This autopsy was privately commissioned by Kendrick's parents. Dr. Anderson's examination found a starkly different conclusion from the GBI's, though. He determined that Kendrick's death was likely the result of, quote, unexplained, apparent, non-accidental blunt force trauma, end quote. In other words, homicide by injuries that were not consistent with an accident. Dr. Anderson reported finding evidence of trauma on the right side of Kendrick's neck and jaw. According to his autopsy report, later quoted in legal documents, there were hemorrhages in the soft tissue of the neck with bleeding that the first autopsy had not noted. This bleeding was around the carotid artery area and jawline, suggesting to Anderson that Kendrick had sustained a blow of significant force to that area. This type of hemorrhaging tells us that this injury occurred while the heart was still pumping prior to death, since blood had to seep into the tissues. Just so you know, blood cannot seep without the heart beating to move it. Dr. Anderson concluded that this neck trauma was the cause of Kendrick's death, not the asphyxia. He felt that that fatal injury was consistent with blunt force, perhaps a blunt object or impact, and that the death should be classified as homicide. In addition, the private autopsy noted some bruising on the right thorax or chest, which might correspond to an impact or struggle. This suggests that Dr. Anderson saw signs that Kendrick's chest had been struck or compressed beyond what positional asphyxia alone could cause. One of the most startling discoveries during the second autopsy had to do not with injuries, though, but with Kendrick's internal organs. When Dr. Anderson opened Kendrick's body, he found that many of the organs were missing. The chest and abdominal cavity had been stuffed with crumpled up newspaper where his organs should have been. This is not a standard practice in modern embalming. Based on what I could find, sawdust and cotton are typically used if organs are missing, and it immediately fueled suspicion. The Johnson family was outraged, believing that this was evidence of tampering or a cover-up. Maybe someone removed those specific organs to conceal injuries. They could have been evidence that would sway the outcome. After the GBI completed their autopsy, the organs were removed during that procedure and exam. After an autopsy, the internal organs are either placed back into the body or sometimes not, depending on the condition of the organs. The funeral home, which prepares the body for burial, stated that when they received Kendrick's body, his organs were not inside. The body arrived with the torso empty. The GBI medical examiner later said that due to the body's partially decomposed state, now remember Kendrick had been dead in that mat for over 20 hours in a warm gym, the organs had, quote, been destroyed through natural process, end quote, and were disposed of as bio-waste before the body was released to the funeral home. Basically, the organs were too decomposed to preserve. Based on what I could find in my research, this isn't common, but it can happen if organs are severely decomposed or if preserving them is deemed unnecessary for determining the cause of death. The funeral home, faced with an empty body cavity, filled it with newspaper as a filler to maintain shape for viewing, which they claim is an acceptable practice. The Georgia Secretary of State's office investigated the funeral home's handling of the body and concluded that while using newspaper wasn't the best practice, the funeral home did not violate any laws or regulations in doing so. The Johnson family was deeply disturbed by their child's missing organs, though. Because no internal organs were available for the second autopsy, any subtle internal injury, like a small heart contusion or subtle lung damage, could not be assessed. This eliminated potential evidence. The family filed a complaint and later a civil lawsuit against the funeral home for mishandling Kendrick's remains, suspecting that the funeral home might have been involved in some type of cover-up in relation to the cause of death. That lawsuit, however, was eventually dropped and dismissed, and no wrongdoing by the funeral home was ever found. For many, the missing organs were a key to solving the case, but for the Johnsons, it was one more reason to distrust the official version of events, and I completely understand why they felt that way. I try really hard to just bite my tongue and share facts with you guys so you can form your own thoughts on each case, but this one is really hard to not let my opinion slip here and there. Dr. Anderson's autopsy findings of neck trauma gave the family new hope that their instincts were right. In October 2013, Benjamin Crump, a high-profile civil rights attorney, joined the case on behalf of the Johnsons. Standing with local counsel C.B. King, Crump declared at a press conference, quote, "Kendrick was murdered, and we intend to get to the truth of what happened," end quote. The family now had medical evidence to challenge the accident ruling. They made it known publicly what was discovered in that second autopsy. On the other hand, law enforcement and school officials maintained their stance that there was no evidence of foul play. The second autopsy report even noted that the trauma was, quote, unexplained, meaning not accounted for by an accident, according to Dr. Anderson. Some experts felt that what he interpreted as hemorrhages from trauma could have been from decomposition or postmortem pooling of blood. If Kendrick's head was engorged with blood after death, some vessels could still potentially rupture or tissues could appear discolored, potentially misleading an examination months later. The GPI pathologist had the advantage of examining the fresh body, though. Dr. Anderson was doing a second autopsy many weeks after embalming and burial, which can impact the accuracy of these findings. These subtleties would be debated by experts, but for the public, it boiled down to this: one autopsy said accident, and one autopsy said homicide. Based on Dr. Anderson's findings, the Johnson family took action. They formally requested that the case be reopened and for a coroner's inquest to review the cause of death. A coroner's inquest is a judicial inquiry that can be held to determine cause of death, sometimes with a jury, and it can potentially lead to a change in the official cause from accident to homicide. They also began calling for the release of all evidence, especially the school's surveillance videos from the gym area, believing that the tapes might show what happened to Kendrick at that time. Lowndes High School had a network of security cameras, including some inside and outside that gym. If Kendrick had been attacked or followed, the hope was that something might be visible on camera. In October 2013, which would have been Kendrick's 18th birthday, the family's attorneys held a press conference, specifically urging authorities to release the surveillance footage from the school. The attorneys questioned why, months after the death, Kendrick's parents still had not been allowed to see the full, unedited surveillance videos. King stated, quote, "For some unknown reason, this tape has been withheld," end quote. By that time, the U.S. Attorney for the Middle District of Georgia, Michael J. Moore, had initiated a federal review, more to come on that later though, and King acknowledged that Moore's office had obtained some surveillance material, but the family's team wasn't sure if they had all of the relevant footage or not. Under mounting public pressure, in November 2013, a judge ordered the release of the surveillance video to the public. 290 hours of footage from 35 different cameras around the school were turned over to CNN, who had filed a lawsuit on behalf of the media to get the videos. CNN then hired a forensic video analyst to comb through all of the video footage. The result was super confusing. While Kendrick does appear on camera at certain points, the analysts found that there were significant gaps in the recordings from specific cameras that covered the areas of interest. For example, cameras overlooking the gymnasium had discontinuous timestamps, meaning footage would jump and there were missing chunks of time in between. But on one set of cameras, an hour and 5 minutes went missing. On another set, about 2 hours and 10 minutes had been missing. Apparently, the investigation found that the camera systems were not perfectly synchronized with each other, and they were motion activated. This means that each camera only records when it detects motion, or a change in pixels, and their internal clocks may have slightly been off. So if one camera picked up motion, it might record continuously, while another camera pointed elsewhere would stay idle, leading to those gaps when you line up their timelines. Timestamp discrepancies of up to 20 minutes between cameras were found, giving the impression of a gap in coverage that wasn't actually a gap in real time, if that makes sense. To make things even worse, the area where the gym mats were stored, in the corner of that old gym, was not covered by any camera. There were cameras in the gym, but none directly watching that corner. What the videos did show was Kendrick walking in the school hallways on January 10th and later entering the gym. Footage showed seeing Kendrick come into the gym at about 1:09 p.m. on January 10th, jogging across the floor and moving toward the area of the mats. No cameras captured what happened next. The next time any image of Kendrick appears is sadly when his body was found the next day, and that part was not released publicly. There were also other students visible in some gym footage, but due to the camera angle and resolution, nothing conclusive could be determined. No confrontation or interaction involving Kendrick is clearly seen on any of the videos that were released. The Johnson family's attorneys were not satisfied. The FBI looked into the surveillance system early on and found that the apparent gaps could be explained by unsynced timestamps and motion activation. But still, controversy continued. An anonymous email was sent to the sheriff's office during this time, claiming knowledge of a student confession in Kendrick's death. This tip was leaked in the media. It fueled rumors naming two brothers as suspects. The brothers were classmates with Kendrick and former friends that had become rivals. One of them allegedly had an altercation with Kendrick on a school trip in 2011. The anonymous email claimed that those brothers attacked Kendrick over a dispute and that their father, who's an FBI agent, helped cover it up, even altering the video footage. These explosive accusations were not unverified, but they spread like wildfire on social media. So, to recap, by the end of 2013, here's where things stood. Local law enforcement had closed the case as an accident, supported by the GBI autopsy. The Johnson family, with attorneys and private autopsy in hand, insisted it was murder and urged the state and federal officials to investigate further. The case gained national attention, pointing out irregularities like the coroner's report and missing organs. And online interest led to different theories, some pointing fingers at specific students like the brothers and former friends. The school and local officials basically went silent publicly, deferring to the ongoing review by federal authorities. Despite all of this, though, one significant development offered the Johnsons hope: the U.S. Department of Justice, or DOJ, investigation. Under pressure from the community and civil rights groups, the U.S. Attorney for the Middle District of Georgia, Michael J. Moore, announced on October 31, 2013, that his office would open up a formal review into Kendrick Johnson's death. This is significant because let's look at Kenneka Jenkins' case for an example. She also died under suspicious circumstances, but the DOJ denied picking up her case. So this felt like a small win for the Johnson family and brought them some sense of hope. Standing on the courthouse steps in Macon, Georgia, Moore said that he would impartially review all of the evidence from the local investigation and any new information to determine if a federal inquiry was warranted. He stressed that he was not taking any theory for granted, not accepting or rejecting the accident conclusion until the facts were examined. Moore also acknowledged the different autopsy findings. He had received the second autopsy report in late August. This was part of why he felt a review was necessary. A U.S. attorney can investigate a death under federal jurisdiction if there is reason to believe that it might involve a civil rights violation or any other federal crime for that matter. In Kendrick's case, since it occurred on school property but not obviously involving a federal crime, they were looking into a potential civil rights violation. It could be a civil rights case if Kendrick was murdered because of his race or any other conspiracy. Moore's team, with assistance from the FBI, began what became a massive investigation. Federal investigators subpoenaed documents, collected evidence, and gathered a grand jury. Over time, the case was actually transferred out of Georgia because Michael Moore resigned in 2015, so the case was then handed over to U.S. Attorney's Office in Northern District of Ohio under Stephen Dettelbach. This is unusual, but it was likely to avoid any conflict of interest since a person of interest parent was in the federal law enforcement in Georgia, the FBI agent father of the two classmates. The Ohio team continued until Dettelbach also resigned in 2016. Despite rotating people, though, the DOJ investigators and FBI pressed on. Here's what the DOJ investigation found. Nearly 100 interviews were conducted. Investigators spoke with students, teachers, staff, first responders, anyone who might have relevant information about the timeline, any conflicts involving Kendrick, or rumors that they had heard. They even interviewed people multiple times if needed and pursued out-of-state leads. They reviewed tens of thousands of emails and text messages. These included communications of students around the time of Kendrick's death, as well as any email communications between school officials or law enforcement that might indicate misconduct. They reviewed the surveillance videos from the school extensively, using FBI video forensic experts to verify if any tampering may have occurred. No inconsistencies were found beyond those gaps that we've already talked about earlier. They collected and analyzed other physical evidence and the records of the events on January 10th and 11th. For instance, they looked at Kendrick's phone records, social media, and the shoes and clothing collected. The DOJ investigative team also consulted independent forensic experts for further help. They brought in an independent medical examiner from the Department of Defense to review the autopsy findings. This DoD examiner reviewed autopsy photos, slides, and reports. Additionally, the DOJ hired another independent forensic pathologist to review the case too. So in total, by the end, 4 separate pathologists had weighed in: GBI's Dr. Gaffney Kraft, the family's Dr. Anderson, and 2 separate experts enlisted by the feds. While the DOJ did not publicly release those experts' full findings, which I personally find odd, the fact that they closed the case suggested that these independent reviews did not confirm the homicide theory. As the federal deep dive continued, something unexpected happened though. In January 2015, confident in the direction of the evidence, Kendrick's parents took the extraordinary step of filing a $100 million civil lawsuit accusing a conspiracy of murder and cover-up. They named 38 defendants, including the 2 student brothers, another student, local school officials, including the superintendent and principal, the local sheriff's deputies, the Valdosta police chief, the GBI agents involved, the state medical examiner, and even the FBI agent, the father of the two students. The lawsuit alleged that the FBI agent father ordered his sons and classmate to attack Kendrick, and that all these officials conspired to cover up the murder. It hinted at a significant effort to obscure evidence, from manipulating the video to influencing the autopsy. The suit claimed that previously Kendrick had been harassed by one of these students, consistent with the bus incident story that we've already gone over a couple times, and that school officials failed to protect him and monitor the area appropriately. This massive lawsuit grabbed headlines, but it also faced major challenges. All the local judges in Lowndes County recused themselves from this case. It had to be moved to another venue in DeKalb County in North Georgia. The defendants denied the allegations. Jim Elliott, the Lowndes County attorney, called these claims, quote, unfounded and baseless, end quote. Meanwhile, the DOJ was concerned that this civil suit could interfere with their investigation. In November 2015, the DOJ filed a motion to pause the civil case because evidence gathering in the lawsuit could reveal information to witnesses or suspects that might impede the federal investigation. They specifically mentioned that their investigation had expanded to examine potential obstructions of justice and witness tampering in the case. This means that the feds were looking not just at possible murder, but whether or not anyone had lied to investigators, intimidated witnesses, or otherwise obstructed justice during the investigation. A judge denied the DOJ's request to pause the civil suit, but shortly after, during March of 2016, the Johnsons voluntarily withdrew their $100 million lawsuit. They said that they did so to wait for the conclusion of the federal investigation and reserved their right to refile it again later. The dismissal of that suit had massive consequences, though. Several defendants, including the parents of the accused brothers, then turned around and sued the Johnsons for their attorney fees and defamation. They argued that the Johnsons' giant lawsuit was without any evidence and that publicly accusing their sons of murder had damaged their reputations. By August 2017, a Superior Court judge, Judge Richard Porter, reviewed the matter and ruled strongly in favor of the defendants. He ordered the Johnsons and their attorney to pay about $292,000 in attorney fees to those that they had accused. Judge Porter stated, quote, testimony shows that they had no evidence to support their claims that the brothers had killed Kendrick Johnson or that any of the other defendants engaged in conspiracy to conceal Kendrick's death, end quote. In addition to that, the family was hit with an $850,000 claim for defense attorney fees and a $1 million defamation claim from some defendants. The Johnson family found themselves in a dire financial position as a result of all of this. During all the legal battles, the DOJ investigation proceeded and reached its conclusion in March 2016. On June 20th, the DOJ announced that it would not file any criminal charges related to Kendrick Johnson's death. U.S. Attorney Michael Moore met with the Johnson family in person to deliver the news before it went public. The DOJ's press release was detailed and definitive. It stated that after an exhaustive investigation, there was, quote, insufficient evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, end quote, that any crime was committed or that any civil rights had been violated. It also explained the high bar for federal charges. They have to have proved that someone killed Kendrick and that it was due to race for a civil rights charge. They did not find evidence that met this threshold either. One telling line from the DOJ statement reads, quote, after extensive investigation into this tragic event, federal investigators determined that there is no sufficient evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that someone or some group of people willfully violated Kendrick Johnson's civil rights or committed any other prosecutable federal crime. With that, the federal case was closed without any charges. This was a severe blow to the Johnson family. After the DOJ's decision, some in the community accepted that the death may truly have been a freak accident. Others, however, including Kendrick's parents, were not buying it. To them, all the unanswered questions and apparent irregularities still pointed to something nefarious. Jackie was quoted saying, quote, if you know something is not right, say something, end quote, urging people to please come forward even after the case had been closed. Kenneth Johnson reiterated that he would never have closure until someone was held accountable. The case was effectively closed at both the state and federal levels at this point. However, the family was not done. In March 2017, they tried to petition the GBI to reopen the case at the state level. That went nowhere. They also sought to have the local coroner, Bill Watson, change Kendrick's death certificate to homicide, which he could do via a coroner's inquest if new evidence emerged. That also didn't happen. Fast forward to 2018. Kendrick's parents made another painful decision. They would exhume Kendrick's body a second time for yet another independent autopsy. This would be the third autopsy overall on Kendrick's remains. In June 2018, Valdosta city officials granted permission for the exhumation. On June 22, 2018, Kendrick's body was exhumed again, 5 years after his death. By this time, the remains would have been in a state of advanced decomposition, but a skilled forensic pathologist can still gather some information from skeletal injuries or other long-lasting evidence. In November 2018, the results of the third autopsy were announced. It corroborated the second autopsy. The third autopsy concluded that Kendrick's death was due to, quote, non-accidental blunt force trauma, end quote, to the right neck and right thorax. In other words, the third examiner agreed that there were injuries that pointed to homicide. This directly contradicted the first autopsy's findings of positional asphyxia from an accident. The third autopsy report noted additional details. For example, it mentioned evidence of trauma to the right chest that perhaps the second autopsy also saw. The conclusion remained that Kendrick likely died from a blow or blows that caused internal hemorrhage and death. In addition to the third autopsy, the family publicized a new piece of evidence, an affidavit from a witness that they had obtained in early 2018. According to this witness affidavit, an individual claimed to have overheard a confession or conversation where someone admitted to killing Kendrick. The affidavit, which had names redacted publicly, stated that a person confessed to striking Kendrick in the neck with a 45-pound dumbbell or weight, and that another person, an agent, helped orchestrate a video edit of the surveillance footage to cover it up. Essentially, this aligned with the theory of the classmates and the FBI agent father. The timing is important, though. The affidavit was dated February 9, 2018. If true, why didn't the DOJ act on this and do something before then? It's possible that this was a new witness that had come forward years later, though. The identity of this witness was not made public, but it was enough for the Johnson family to demand that the case be opened again. Kendrick's mother, Jackie, said that they turned over the third autopsy report, the affidavit, and other findings to the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office, urging them to please reopen the investigation in light of this new evidence. In the court of public opinion, this reignited supporters who believed that the truth had been suppressed this entire time. The former Lowndes County Sheriff, Chris Pine, retired in 2017, and a new sheriff, Ashley Polk, took office. Polk was not involved in that original investigation in 2013. He publicly said that he had no reason to defend the previous conclusions and was open to reviewing the case if new evidence warranted. So, the Johnsons asked him to, especially after that final autopsy. Finally, in March 2021, Sheriff Ashley Polk officially reopened the Kendrick Johnson case. By this time, 8 years had passed since Kendrick's death. The reopening was because Polk had managed to get the entire federal investigative file, which had 17 boxes of documents and evidence that the DOJ had actually compiled. Polk said, "Let me see everything from the FBI and DOJ, and we'll go through it ourselves." He spent about 13 months alongside 2 other investigators reviewing every piece of evidence as if it were brand new to him. Throughout 2021, Polk's team re-interviewed some witnesses and consulted with outside agencies. The volume of material was massive. This was the 4th investigation of the case. The Johnson family at first cautiously welcomed Polk's review and even cooperated by providing info that they had gathered. But as months went on, their relationship declined. Polk later mentioned that the Johnsons stopped communicating with him completely, possibly out of frustration or distrust. In January 2022, Sheriff Polk announced the conclusion of his review. He provided a 16-page synopsis report of his findings for the public to see. The bottom line, the death was a tragic accident, reaffirming the original investigation. Polk stated unequivocally, quote, "There was no homicide, no cover-up, no conspiracy in the death of the teen. It was simply a tragic and bizarre accident," unquote. He added that he was not claiming the original investigators did anything wrong or that their conclusion was wrong. He agreed with them. Polk explicitly said that the 2 brothers accused by the Johnsons, quote, "are not suspects," end quote, and that they had been cleared. Sheriff Polk's synopsis reinforced the DOJ's findings. One quote from his report stated, quote, "All of the evidence, testimony, interviews, grand jury testimony, and even the blatant coercion and intimidation of some persons being questioned does not produce anything to prove any criminal act by anyone that would have resulted in the death of Kendrick. Paul also invited anyone with new tangible information to please come forward for official review. Importantly, he insisted that it must be real evidence with a source, being facts, not opinions or feelings, like Michael Moore had also said years earlier. They basically were pleading for an end to these baseless rumors at this point. Knowing that his report would not sit well with Kendrick's family, Paul released it to the media on January 26, 2022. He said he did try to reach out to the Johnsons beforehand, but got no response. He did speak with the Bell family, that's actually the name of the accused brothers, to give them a courtesy heads up that the report would exonerate their sons. As expected, the Johnson family was disappointed, to put it mildly. This was their last hope, so who wouldn't feel that way? Jackie Johnson went on Facebook Live soon afterwards, calling Paul a liar and rejecting his conclusions. 2 days later, the family held a protest outside the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office, with Jackie saying, quote, "They can always try and do what they want, but I'm going to stay in their face," unquote. They made it clear that they still believed that Kendrick had been murdered and vowed to continue fighting for their son. In response to the Johnsons calling him a liar, Sheriff Paulk did something really dramatic. He announced he was personally offering a $500,000 reward out of his own pocket for anyone that could bring forth information leading to an arrest and conviction of murder in Kendrick's case. He said, quote, "Because of these statements from the Johnsons, I am personally, with my own funds, offering a reward of $500,000 to anyone who can come forward with information that results in the arrest and conviction of a person for the alleged murder of Kendrick Johnson," end quote. This reward stands currently. Since its announcement, no one has come forward with any solid new evidence to claim it. After the 2022 closure of the case, that was the final official word. No active investigations currently remain. To this day, Kendrick Johnson's death remains officially classified as an accidental suffocation. This case is closed in the eyes of law enforcement, but it lives on as an example of how difficult it can be for a grieving family to accept an answer that feels incomplete. The Johnson family firmly believes that there's more to the story. They have faced legal setbacks and even financial penalties for their accusations, but they continue to fight for justice for Kendrick. Regardless of whether you personally believe it was an accident or homicide, it is impossible not to feel for Kendrick's parents. As of 2025, Kendrick Johnson would have been 30 years old. The death of Kendrick Johnson remains heavily debated, but in the eyes of the law, it's a closed case. Kendrick was laid to rest 3 times, but the quest for truth by his loved ones continues on and keeps his story alive. It is a heart-wrenching example of how outcomes in forensic cases don't always go how we think that they will, especially when the death is as shocking and deeply saddening as this one. I'm sure that everyone here can agree that the loss of a promising 17-year-old like Kendrick Johnson is an absolute tragedy. I pray that he's resting peacefully and that his family finds comfort somehow, despite all that they have endured and continue to. Thank you all so much for spending time with me today. Don't forget to drop me a case recommendation in the comments down below, and our sacred handshake, blue butterfly per usual. Please be sure to take extra great care of yourselves this week. Nurses' orders. See you next time. Bye, guys.